Hello and welcome. Long before the burning mountain fell, before Istar sank beneath waves that would bear its name forever, there were voices crying out into the gathering dark. You have walked through the well-worn paths of Krynn's history, traced the rise of the dragon high lords, celebrated the heroes of the lance, mourned the cataclysm as an inevitable tragedy written in the stars. But tonight, you will discover what has been carefully obscured beneath centuries of ash and deliberate forgetting. The true clerics, the prophets, the seers who saw the shape of destruction, approaching and spoke their warnings into a world that had grown too proud to listen. These are the Forgotten Oracles of Krynn's silent ages, and their echoes still reverberate through the foundations of the world, waiting for those patient enough to excavate them from the rubble of history. The world of Krynn has always existed in unusual proximity to its creators. The gods of Krynn, children of the high god who brought order from chaos itself, maintained direct and intimate relationships with the mortals they shaped from possibility and stone. Three divine siblings form the foundation of all that exists on Krynn. Paladin, called the Platinum Dragon, the valiant warrior, who champions good and law and the preservation of life. Jillian, the Grey Voyager, keeper of the Tobril, the book of all truth, who maintains perfect neutrality and records every moment of existence without judgment. And Takasis, the Queen of Darkness, the many-headed dragon who believes she alone should rule all creation, and who has orchestrated every great war and catastrophe in pursuit of that absolute dominion. Around these three gathered the other gods of Krynn, 21 deities organized into three pillars of good, neutrality, and evil, each faction dwelling in their own corner of the outer planes. This divine structure created something unique among all the worlds of the multiverse. The gods of Krynn did not remain distant and unknowable. They walked among mortals, took physical forms, spoke directly to their chosen servants. When the clerics of Krynn called upon their deities, those deities answered with immediate and undeniable power. Healing flowed from the hands of Meshakel's priests. Strength surged through the warriors, blessed by Kiri Jolith. Vengeance manifested through Sargonas's chosen instruments of wrath. The connection between divine and mortal was not faith in the abstract, but tangible, measurable, and absolutely real. Among these servants of the gods, certain individuals received a gift more terrible than any other: the ability to see beyond the present moment, to perceive the threads of causation as they wove themselves into inevitable futures. These were the true prophets, the oracles whose sight pierced the veil between what is and what will be. They did not interpret omens or read signs in the movements of birds and the patterns of thrown bones. They saw, with the clarity granted by divine revelation, the actual shape of coming events. And what they saw, they were compelled to speak, regardless of whether anyone wished to hear their words. You must understand that prophecy in Krynn carried a weight unknown in other realms. When an oracle spoke, they channeled the perspective of gods who existed outside linear time, who could see past and future as mortals see the walls of the room around them. Based on what we know of divine intervention throughout Krynn's history, the visions granted to these seers would have been not metaphorical or symbolic, but literal and specific. An oracle who proclaimed that fire would fall from the sky was not speaking in poetic imagery. They were describing the precise moment when a burning mountain would tear through the atmosphere and strike the heart of a continent, reshaping the world in an instant of divine wrath. The periods when prophetic voices fell into hushed whispers or ceased entirely occurred not through natural cycles, but, as the historical record suggests, through deliberate forces. The most famous of these silences came after the Cataclysm, when the gods withdrew from Krynn entirely, leaving mortals to survive in what would become known as the Age of Despair. For over 3 centuries, from the Cataclysm until the War of the Lance restored divine connection, the world stumbled forward without the guidance of true clerical power. False prophets rose in that vacuum, charlatans and self-deluded mystics who claimed divine authority they did not possess. The Seekers, as they called themselves, spread across the continent promising new gods, new truths, new paths to salvation. But their miracles were illusions, and their promises hollow. But this age of despair, this great silence following the Cataclysm, was not the first time prophetic voices had been stilled. Throughout Krynn's long history, given what we understand about how power and prophecy intersected in places like Istar, there would have been other periods when seers found themselves unable or unwilling to speak the visions burning behind their eyes. To understand why requires journeying back through the ages, past the Age of Might, when Istar's power spread across Ansalin, past the Age of Dreams, when the first mortal civilizations rose and fell, all the way to the foundations of the world itself. In the Age of Starbirth, when the gods first brought order to chaos and populated Krynn with its original inhabitants, there was no need for prophecy. The gods walked openly among their creations, and the future unfolded according to their direct and immediate will. But as the ages turned and mortals gained agency, as free will complicated the simple execution of divine plans, the gods required intermediaries. They needed voices that could speak to mortals in mortal terms, translating the incomprehensible vastness of divine perspective into words and visions that limited minds could grasp. The Age of Dreams, spanning from approximately 9,000 years before the founding of great kingdoms until roughly 1,000 years before that milestone, saw the rise of the first great civilizations of Krynn and with them, what we can reasonably infer were the first formal traditions of prophecy. The ogre empires, which dominated vast territories during this period, were not the degraded, monstrous creatures of later ages. The original ogres were beings of sublime beauty and profound intelligence, one of the favored races chosen by the gods to inherit Krynn. Given the sophistication of their civilization and their close relationship with the divine, it stands to reason that they would have maintained networks of seers and prophets to guide their expanding empire. The historical records that survived into later ages confirm that ogre society was highly organized and deeply engaged with matters of religion and divine favor. From this, we can infer that prophecy would have played a significant role in their governance and cultural practices. The ogres built magnificent cities through the labor of enslaved humans, raising monuments whose scale would not be matched until Istar's golden age thousands of years later. Such ambitious construction projects would logically have benefited from prophetic guidance regarding optimal locations, resource allocation, and long-term planning. Yet we also know that the ogres fell from their position of dominance, their civilization collapsing, and their very nature degrading from beauty into ugliness, from intelligence into brutish cunning. This transformation occurred gradually across centuries, beginning around 6,000 years before the founding of organized human kingdoms, and continuing until the ogres existed only as tribal societies of monsters. This raises a compelling question. If the ogres possessed prophets and oracles, as their level of civilization suggests they must have, did those seers foresee this degradation? And if they did, why could they not prevent it? The answer, which later ages would learn through bitter experience, lies in the fundamental nature of prophecy itself. Divine sight reveals what will be, not what might be prevented. The oracles who served the ogre empires, assuming they existed as the sophistication of that culture implies, would have seen their civilizations fall approaching with terrible clarity. They would have watched in their visions as beauty curdled into monstrosity, as their magnificent cities crumbled into ruins, and they would have been powerless to change what the gods had already determined would occur. One ogre whose story survived into the historical record was Igraine, a governor who learned compassion from a human slave and eventually broke away from ogre society to become the leader of the Urda. Ogres who maintained their original beauty and intelligence. This suggests that at least some among the ogres recognized the corruption spreading through their race and attempted to resist it. Whether Igraine's choice was influenced by prophetic warning or by his own moral awakening, we cannot know with certainty. But his story demonstrates that knowledge of impending disaster, whether prophetically revealed or logically deduced, does not guarantee the power to prevent it when divine will has already been set in motion. The elves, who observed the rise and fall of the ogre empires from their forests, developed their own traditions that would have included forms of prophetic practice. Elven civilization emerged as a significant force around 4,000 years before the rise of organized human kingdoms, when they united under Silvano's golden eye and migrated to the lands that would become Sylvanstein. The deep connection elves maintained with the natural world and with the gods of nature, particularly Kislev, suggests they would have developed oracle traditions distinct from those of the ogres, where ogre prophecy, based on what we know of their culture, would likely have focused on domination and expansion. Elven seers would have approached the future as witnesses to natural cycles and divine patterns. The historical record shows that elves faced repeated conflicts with both ogres and dragons throughout the Age of Dreams. The First Dragon War lasted approximately 350 years, beginning around 3,900 years before organized human kingdoms, and ending with elven victory. The Second Dragon War followed centuries later. That the elves survived these prolonged conflicts and eventually prospered suggests they possessed some form of strategic foresight, whether through prophetic gifts granted by their gods or through other means of divine guidance. Throughout this Age of Dreams, as civilizations rose and fell, and the balance of power shifted between races, the gods maintained active presence in the world. They granted powers to their clerics, performed miracles, and presumably channeled visions through those individuals whose minds were suited to receive prophetic sight. The temples and sacred sites constructed during this age, including places like Godshome in the Kalkist Mountains, which became one of the most holy locations in all of Krynn, served as focal points for divine interaction with mortals. Godshome in particular, a hidden valley containing 21 colossal stones representing the gods, and a perfect disk of polished black stone that reflected the sky regardless of the time of day, was a place where the gods revealed themselves directly to those they chose. Such a location would naturally have been associated with prophetic revelation and divine visions. The relationship between mortal and divine during this age established patterns that would persist throughout Krynn's history. The gods were present, active, and willing to communicate with their creations. Clerics channeled genuine divine power, and among those clerics, certain individuals received the gift or curse of prophetic sight, the ability to see beyond the present moment into futures that had already been written by divine will. These oracles, regardless of which race or culture they belonged to, faced the same fundamental challenge. They saw what was coming, but seeing did not grant them the power to change it. As the Age of Dreams drew toward its close, and human civilizations began to rise in earnest. The foundations had been laid for prophetic traditions that would continue through subsequent ages. The knowledge that the future could be seen, that gods could and would grant visions to chosen mortals, that prophecy was real and literal rather than metaphorical. This understanding became part of Krynn's fundamental reality, and with it came the harder knowledge that prophetic sight often brought more torment than comfort, that seeing disaster approach without possessing the means to prevent it created a unique form of suffering that would drive many seers to silence or madness in the ages to come. Section 2. Echoes from the Age of Dreams. The Age of Dreams stretches across thousands of years of Krynn's history, from approximately 9,000 years before the founding of organized kingdoms, until roughly 1,000 years before that milestone, marking the transition into the Age of Might. This vast expanse of time saw the birth and fall of the first great civilizations, the establishment of traditions that would influence all subsequent ages, and the creation of sacred sites, whose significance would persist long after their builders turned to dust. To understand those who might have shaped this age through prophetic sight requires descending into layers of history so ancient that even the elves, with their centuries-long memories, preserve only fragments and echoes of what once was. The world that emerged from the Age of Starbirth was populated by races chosen by the gods to inherit Krynn. The ogres, created as beings of beauty and intelligence, were granted dominion over vast territories. The elves, formed with an innate connection to the natural world and an existence that stretched across centuries, claimed the forests and wild places. Humans, shorter-lived but adaptable and ambitious, spread across every climate and terrain, though many found themselves enslaved by the dominant ogre empires. Each race developed their own relationship with the divine, their own methods of worship and divine connection. And based on what we understand about clerical traditions in later ages, their own ways of receiving divine guidance and revelation, the ogre empires of the Age of Dreams controlled extensive territories, building cities through the labor of enslaved humans, and raising monuments whose scale and grandeur would not be matched until Istar's golden age thousands of years later. These early ogres bore no resemblance to the degraded, monstrous creatures that would survive into later ages. They possessed beauty that even elves acknowledged, and intellects capable of complex reasoning and sophisticated governance. Given the sophistication of their civilization and the active presence of the gods during this period, it stands to reason that the ogres would have maintained religious structures and clerical orders similar to those that emerged in later ages, which would likely have included individuals who received prophetic visions. The historical record confirms that ogre civilization was highly organized and maintained close relationships with the divine powers. However, we also know that this civilization fell into corruption and degradation. The transformation began around 6,000 years before the founding of organized human kingdoms and continued across centuries until the ogres had devolved into the monstrous tribal societies that would terrorize later ages. One notable exception was Igraine, a governor who learned compassion from a human slave and eventually broke away to become the leader of the Urda. Ogres who preserved their original beauty and intelligence. This raises questions about whether ogre seers, if they existed as the sophistication of their culture suggests, foresaw this degradation. The pattern that would repeat throughout Krynn's history, where prophetic warnings went unheeded by civilizations at the height of their power, may have had its origins in this ancient age. The ogre's fall demonstrates that even beings of great beauty and intelligence could be subject to transformation they could not prevent, suggesting that divine will operated according to purposes that mortal wisdom, even prophetically enhanced, could not fully grasp or alter. While the ogre empires dominated the plains and lowlands, the elves emerged as a significant civilization around 4,000 years before the rise of organized human kingdoms. They united under Silvano's golden eye and migrated to the lands that would become Sylvansti. The elves quickly discovered that the forests they claimed were already occupied by dragons, and thus began the First Dragon War, lasting from approximately 3,500 to 3,350 years before the founding of kingdoms. Thousands of elves died in these battles, and when they were on the verge of extinction, the gods of magic, Lunitari, Solinari, and Nuitari, granted them the knowledge to create dragonstones, rune-bearing crystals that could trap a dragon's soul. The survival of the elven people through this existential threat suggests they possessed some form of divine guidance, whether through prophetic gifts or other means of communication with their gods. The deep connection elves maintained with the natural world and with deities like Kislev, goddess of nature, would have created channels through which divine wisdom could flow. Sylvansti religious practices, as they developed over subsequent centuries, became deeply intertwined with magical traditions, with grand temples serving as both houses of worship and centers of arcane study, where clerics and mages alike were considered conduits of divine will. This blending of magical and divine practice in elven culture creates a foundation from which we can infer that elven seers would have approached prophecy differently than other races, where ogre civilization, based on what we know of its hierarchical and domination-focused nature, would likely have viewed prophecy as a tool for maintaining control and planning expansion. Elven culture's emphasis on harmony with nature and the passage of time suggests their prophets would have seen themselves as witnesses to natural cycles and divine patterns rather than as controllers of destiny. The elves faced a second dragon war centuries later, from approximately 2690 to 2645 years before the founding of kingdoms, when dragon stones discovered by dwarves were accidentally brought to the surface, releasing the trapped dragons. 3 mages and a scion defeated the dragons, though many died, and the dragons were transported to the beyond with the lost citadel. This second conflict further demonstrates that even with divine favor and magical prowess, the elves faced repeated existential threats that required divine intervention and sacrifice to overcome. Sylvanos, the great elven leader who united his people and founded Sylvansti, died in 2515 years before the founding of kingdoms, succeeded by his son Sithel. The Palace of Quinari was built during this transition of power, and tensions between Sylvansti and the human empire of Urgoth began to mount. Throughout these centuries of conflict, growth, and political evolution, the elves would have maintained whatever prophetic and clerical traditions they had developed, preserving knowledge and wisdom that would influence their culture for millennia to come. Beneath the waves, the sea elves emerged as distinct peoples during the Age of Dreams. The Daimernesti, or shoal elves, and the Darganesti, or deep elves, were originally descendants of House Mariner of the Sylvansti. Over time, they adapted to life underwater, developing physical traits to match their aquatic environment. Their origins trace back to when the Greystone of Gargath fractured their connection to surface-dwelling elves, causing House Mariner to splinter and evolve over centuries into 2 distinct underwater civilizations. The sea elves developed their own religious practices centered on deities connected to the ocean. They revered Habakkuk, called Abuk the Fisher, as god of the sea and life, guardian of the ocean's bounty and balance. Kislev, known to them as Kisla, the mother of sea creatures, was revered as the mother of all aquatic life. And Zebom, goddess of the seas, storms, and strife, whose moods change with the storm, was worshipped in certain cities like Urione, representing the chaotic, destructive side of the sea. Interestingly, the Darganesti in their capital city of Watermere venerated figures believed to be historical rather than divine, including one known as Daedalin the Dreamer, described as a seer whose prophecies guided the Darganesti's path. This suggests that prophetic traditions existed among the sea elves, with certain seers achieving such significance that they were remembered and honored across millennia. Whether Daedalin received visions through divine connection to Zebim, Kislev, or Habakkuk, or through some other means tied to the unique nature of underwater existence, we cannot know with certainty. But the preservation of this figure in Darganesti culture demonstrates that prophecy played a role in shaping their civilization. The sea elves' temples were constructed in harmony with the ocean, incorporating glowing coral and shimmering crystals to create ethereal spaces for worship and ceremony. These underwater structures, built to function in an environment radically different from surface temples, would have required different architectural approaches to facilitate divine connection. The physics of water, the pressure of the depths, the unique properties of sound and light beneath the waves. All of these factors would have influenced how sea elf clerics and prophets experienced divine revelation. The dwarven races also developed during the Age of Dreams, emerging from the chosen of Riorks. When Riorks became angered by the pride of his chosen people, he changed them into gnomes around 4,000 years before the founding of kingdoms. The chosen ones, also called Scions, built the city of Calthax between 3,100 and 2,900 years before kingdoms, but eventually left to delve underground homes in the Kalkist Mountains to escape the effects of the Gragem. These dwarves discovered the dragon stones in the city of Thorin around 2,710 years before kingdoms, accidentally triggering the Second Dragon War when the stones were brought to the surface. Dwarven culture, centered on the god Riorks and emphasizing craftsmanship, engineering, and the shaping of stone and metal, would have developed religious traditions focused on creation and practical application of divine gifts. While the historical record does not detail extensive dwarven prophetic traditions during this age, the fact that they maintained clerical orders and worshipped Riorks suggests they would have had some means of receiving divine guidance, even if prophecy was not as central to their culture as it appears to have been for elves, or potentially for ogres. Throughout this Age of Dreams, as civilizations rose and fell, and the balance of power shifted between races, the gods maintained active and direct presence in the world. They granted powers to their clerics, performed miracles that demonstrated their reality beyond doubt, and communicated with mortals through various means. Sacred sites like Godshome in the Kalkist Mountains, with its 21 colossal stones representing the gods, and its perfect disk of polished black stone that reflected the sky regardless of time of day, served as focal points where the gods revealed themselves directly to those they chose. The relationship between mortal and divine during this age established patterns that would persist throughout Krynn's history. The gods were present, active, and willing to communicate with their creations. Clerics channeled genuine divine power that could heal, protect, and work miracles. And among those clerics, based on what we understand from later ages, certain individuals would have received prophetic visions, the ability to see beyond the present moment into futures shaped by divine will. These seers, regardless of which race or culture they belonged to, would have faced the same fundamental challenge that would haunt prophets throughout all subsequent ages. They could see what was coming, but seeing did not necessarily grant them the power to change it. As the Age of Dreams drew toward its close and human civilizations began to rise in earnest, particularly the Empire of Urgoth, which expanded its borders significantly under Emperor Akeldermot around 2,500 to 2,200 years before kingdoms. The foundations had been laid for traditions that would continue through subsequent ages. The knowledge that the future could be perceived through divine sight, that gods granted visions to chosen mortals, that prophecy was real and carried weight. This understanding became part of Krynn's fundamental reality. And with it came the awareness that prophetic sight often brought as much burden as blessing. That seeing disaster approach without possessing the means to prevent it created unique suffering that would shape the lives of seers throughout all the ages to come. Section 3. The Age of Might and Warnings Unheeded. The Age of Might emerged from the conclusion of the Third Dragon War, spanning from approximately 1,000 years before the Cataclysm until that catastrophic event itself. This age saw the rise of human civilization to heights that would define Ansalin's political and religious landscape. The establishment of Istar as the dominant power across the continent, and the slow corruption of faith into something the gods themselves would eventually be forced to destroy. Within this golden age of human achievement, those who served the true gods and received prophetic visions found their voices increasingly constrained, their warnings dismissed or reinterpreted, their sight obscured by the very power structures they were meant to guide. You must understand that Istar did not begin as the corrupt theocracy it would become in its final decades. The city-state had its origins somewhere between 1,750 and 1,300 years before the Cataclysm, during the latter period of the Age of Dreams, a time known as the Time of Might. Following the Third Dragon War, Istar opened the Age of Might proper in 1,000 years before the Cataclysm, at the apex of its influence in Ansalin. Its trade standards had been adopted by most other nations, and its ships were welcomed everywhere they dropped anchor. Istar's goods were recognized as the standard of luxury, and its civilization was considered the epitome of human expression. The holy orders of the stars, the organized hierarchies of priests and clerics serving the gods of good, neutrality, and evil, maintained their traditional structures during Istar's early centuries. The Order of Good, led by a chosen prophet of Paladine, and 6 other prophets representing Meshachel, Kiri Jalith, Habakkuk, Branchala, Solinari, and Majere, spoke prophecies that emphasized hope and righteousness. Based on what we understand about how clerical orders functioned, these prophets would have guided policy and planning, their visions shaping the decisions of Istar's leadership during the city's rise to prominence. The institution of the king priest emerged as Istar's supreme religious and political authority, with the first king crowned in 962 years before the Cataclysm. This dual role, combining temporal power with spiritual leadership, created a concentration of authority that would prove dangerous in later centuries. The early king priests, based on the historical accounts that survived, appear to have been genuinely devoted to serving the gods and promoting righteousness throughout Ansalin. Their use of divine power to heal, protect, and guide their people demonstrated the reality of their connection to Paladin and the gods of light. For several centuries, Istar's expansion and influence continued largely unchecked. The city benefited enormously when dwarves drove ogres from Thoradin between 1,000 and 800 years before the Cataclysm, becoming the major supply center for dwarven kingdoms. Its wealth grew, its territory expanded, and its religious authority spread across the continent. For many years, it seemed that Istarans could do nothing wrong. But as the centuries passed and Istar's power grew, something fundamental began to shift in the relationship between political authority and divine truth. The pattern that would eventually lead to catastrophe started subtly, with king priests who began to view their interpretation of divine will as paramount, who treated dissenting voices and uncomfortable prophecies not as divine guidance requiring consideration, but as challenges to rightfully established authority. The rise of Beldinas, who would become the last king priest, marked the acceleration of this transformation. The first daughter of Paladin followed a vision which led her to a prophesied savior, the Lightbringer, and she found Beldin, as he was then known, in his monastery. They were traveling to Istar when the current king priest died, and the first son of Paladin took up the mantle. With Fistendantilus, the dark wizard, whispering in his ear and manipulating him, the first son craved power and cast the first daughter and Beldin out of the church before they even returned home. The journey to Istar took a long time, and everywhere they went, Beldin was curing the sick and injured, building up a following which journeyed with him to ultimately challenge Kurnos, the first son and resident king priest. Beldin was able to recover the lost crown of power, the Maisram, with the aid of a devotee. Kurnos tried to assassinate Beldin, the first of many attempts at his life, which would drive him into darkness as a ruler, but killed the first daughter instead. A second attempt took the life of Cathan, his dear friend. Beldin raised him from the dead and arrived at Istar, confronted Kurnos, and took the throne. Beldin became Beldina's Pylophero, the Lightbringer, the king priest of Istar, and declared war on all evil. The king priest's reign began in glory. His success at rooting out evil with his knighthood, the divine hammer, was encouraging to him and his followers. He possessed beauty that mortals described as almost divine and clerical powers that exceeded those of previous king priests. When he healed the sick, they did not merely recover, but emerged healthier than before illness struck. When he blessed crops, harvests multiplied. When he spoke, his words carried such conviction and authority that even the cynical found themselves believing. But in a vacuum of evil, victories must still be made, and lesser evils were rooted out. Then he began reading the thoughts of his people and arresting those around him with fleeting evil thoughts. And lastly, he declared all neutral gods and their followers to be evil. His sway over the public was incredible and terrifying. No one was safe, no one was holy enough, and no one could stop the king priest. This persecution of the neutral gods represented a fundamental break with the balance that had defined Krynn's cosmology since its creation. The gods were organized in three pillars: good, neutrality, and evil. And this balance was essential to the world's functioning. By declaring that neutrality was equivalent to evil, Beldenaz was not merely making a theological error. He was challenging the fundamental structure of divine reality, insisting that his understanding of righteousness superseded the wisdom of the gods themselves. Those who served the neutral gods, including clerics, and any who might have possessed prophetic gifts, found themselves persecuted alongside followers of dark deities. The worship of Jillian, keeper of the Tobril and god of balance, was banned. The three gods of magic, Solinari, Lunitari, and Nuitari, came under suspicion, and wizards found themselves targeted by Asterian inquisitors regardless of which moon they served or how they used their power. Many mages fled to the Tower of High Sorcery at Wayreth, the one tower that remained mobile and hidden, protected by magic too powerful for even Istar to overcome. Given what we understand about how prophetic traditions functioned in earlier ages, and the essential role that neutral deities like Jillian played in granting visions and preserving truth, this persecution would have devastated the oracle networks that had previously guided Asterian policy. Seers who served neutral gods would have been silenced or driven underground. Even prophets serving the gods of light would have found themselves constrained if their visions contradicted the king priest's certainty. The suppression of uncomfortable prophecy, which may have begun as occasional dismissal of warnings that challenged official policy, would have accelerated into systematic elimination of dissenting voices. The manipulation of Fistendantilus throughout this process adds another layer to understanding how prophecy failed to prevent the catastrophe. The dark wizard was whispering in the ears of king priests, influencing their decisions, pushing them toward greater extremes of pride and persecution. If prophets saw this influence and tried to warn about it, their warnings would likely have been interpreted as attempts by evil to undermine the holy mission Beldenas believed he was pursuing. The very clarity of prophetic sight, which in earlier ages had been valued precisely because it revealed uncomfortable truths, became a liability in an environment where truth was defined by the king priest's interpretation of divine will. As the years progressed and Beldenaz's power grew more absolute, the warnings that would have come through prophetic channels were systematically dismissed or reinterpreted. When seers glimpsed the approaching catastrophe, when they saw the burning mountain that would fall from the sky and the devastation that would follow, they would have faced an impossible choice. Speak the truth and be branded as servants of evil, or remain silent and watch the disaster approach without warning anyone who might listen. The gods themselves, watching this corruption unfold, began sending their own warnings through increasingly dramatic means. The 13 omens that manifested in the days immediately before the cataclysm were the final, unmistakable signs that judgment approached. These warnings began with the disappearance of all true clerics throughout the land on the day of Yule. Those whose power came from genuine divine connection, rather than from the king priest's own redistributed authority, were taken away, removed from the world to spare them from the horror about to unfold. The sky above Istar turned green, and a cyclone formed, spinning endlessly in place. The Kender, whose fearlessness was legendary, were seized by unprecedented fear and panic. Moonless nights came when only Nuitari was present in the sky. The eternal flame of Thoradin burned black instead of its sacred gold. Throughout Salamnia, fires refused to light. Storms and wildfires ravaged the plains of Abanasinia. People turned on each other throughout the land, including Lord Soth, the knight whose actions would seal both his own fate and the world's. Unnatural fog engulfed Palanthas. In Sylvansti, trees wept blood from their bark. The animals of Qualinsti went mad, stampeding and attacking without provocation. Along the northern coasts, tides ran red with blood. And finally, the Lords of Doom and other mountains erupted, spewing ash and fire into the sky. 13 warnings, each more terrible and undeniable than the last. Paladin even offered redemption to Lord Soth if he would confront and battle the king priest. But Soth failed to even make the journey to Istar. It seemed as though the fate of the world was sealed. Beldenaz interpreted every sign not as divine warning, but as attacks by the forces of darkness, desperate attempts to prevent his glorious transformation. He had spent years purging Krynn of everything he deemed impure, and his certainty had become unshakable. On the 3rd day of the new year, on the 13th day of Yule, he demanded that the gods grant him godhood itself. insisting he could do a better job of ruling creation than they could. The answer came not in words, but in fire. Paladine's flaming hammer, a burning mountain cast down by divine will, struck Istar and eradicated it, changing the face of Krynn forever. Multiple impacts occurred across Ansalin as the gods delivered their unified judgment. The ground shockwave from the various impacts fractured the planet along fault lines, causing volcanoes and earthquakes. Istar vanished beneath the waves, dragged into an abyss that would fill with water and become the Blood Sea. Tidal waves swept inland for miles. Ash and debris thrown into the atmosphere blocked the sun for months, triggering a volcanic winter that destroyed crops and plunged the world into cold and darkness. The sin of hubris was perhaps the first sin the king priest committed. And yes, Fistandantilus was manipulating the king priests the whole time. But the choice to act was still on the shoulders of the king priests. Belden or Beldenus Pylophero, or the Lightbringer, or the king priest of Istar, destroyed the world in his effort to purify it. The prophets who had foreseen this moment, who had tried through whatever means, remained available to warn anyone who would listen, died with their prophecies proven absolutely correct and absolutely useless. Their warnings had been dismissed, their visions reinterpreted, their voices silenced by a power structure so convinced of its own righteousness that it could not recognize divine judgment, even when that judgment manifested in 13 unmistakable omens. And then came the silence. The gods withdrew from Krynn entirely, not merely limiting their interaction with mortals, but removing themselves completely from the world they had created. For 348 years, from the Cataclysm until the War of the Lance, no cleric could channel genuine divine power. The Age of Despair had begun, and with it, the longest and most complete silence prophecy had ever known. Section 4. Silence and Shadows in the Age of Despair. The gods departed in the fire and ash of their own judgment, and the world that remained was fundamentally transformed. The Age of Despair stretched across 3 centuries and 48 years, from the Cataclysm in Zero Dale Reckoning until the War of the Lance restored divine connection in the year 348. You must understand that this was not merely an absence of divine favor or a temporary withdrawal of blessings. This was complete and absolute severance, a disconnection so total that the prayers of even the most faithful rose into empty void and returned unanswered. The clerics who had channeled divine power found their abilities gone, their connection to the gods severed as completely as if the deities themselves had died. And those who had possessed prophetic sight, if any survived the cataclysm itself, were blinded, left to stumble through the present with no vision beyond what mortal eyes could perceive. The immediate aftermath of the cataclysm was chaos beyond description. The continent of Ansalin had been physically reshaped. Coastlines redrawn, mountains toppled, entire regions drowned or buried. Millions died in the initial impacts and the disasters that followed. Survivors emerged from collapsed buildings and flooded valleys to find the world unrecognizable. The familiar landmarks of their lives erased or transformed beyond recognition. And when they turned to their gods for comfort, for healing, for any sign that divine protection might shield them from further suffering, they found only silence. The age of despair is divided into two periods: the time of darkness from 1 to 331 Dale reckoning, when nations descended into squalor and the Knights of Solamnia became a dishonored group, and the time of dragons from 332 to 353 Dale reckoning, when Takasis launched the War of the Lance upon Ansalin. During the Shadow Years, the first 3 centuries after the cataclysm, famine and plague spread across the continent. The Knights of Solamnia, who had failed to stop the cataclysm, were hated and persecuted by populations looking for someone to blame for their suffering. Those oracles who survived the cataclysm faced a unique form of torment. If they had spent their lives channeling visions of the future, their minds expanded to contain prophetic knowledge that ordinary mortals could never grasp. The sudden closure of that channel would have been devastating. They were left with normal human perception, limited to the present moment, and to memories of futures they had once seen, but could no longer access. Based on what we understand about the psychological impact of losing abilities that had defined one's entire existence, many would have struggled to adjust to this sudden blindness. But some survived, and these surviving seers would have become repositories of the last genuine prophetic knowledge Krynn would possess for over 3 centuries. They could no longer see new futures, but they would have remembered the visions they had received before the gods departed. They would have recalled prophecies that had not yet manifested, warnings about events still to come, glimpses of the age of despair itself that earlier oracles had recorded. This preserved knowledge, passed down through oral tradition or recorded in hidden texts, would have provided guidance for survival in a world without divine intervention. The absence of true clerical power created a vacuum that false prophets rushed to fill. The Seeker movement began during the Shadow Years, initially as a loose organization of individuals searching for evidence of the gods, any gods. A loose-knit organization of clerics traveled to the towns of Haven, Solace, and Gateway, preaching the Seeker philosophy. There was yet no formalized religion, just the movement of searching for evidence of the gods. They initially worked independently, but quickly realized the strength in numbers and organization. So they began to hold meetings, formalizing the religion. The Seekers were not the only group leveraging the absence of the gods to manipulate and control people. In Haven specifically, there was a religion which sprang up around the serpent god Belzer. The brown-robed clerics who served Belzer were loath to give up any control over the populace. They would kidnap and murder Seeker representatives when they began preaching in Haven and showcase nightly miracles in their temple. The largest hindrance to winning over the population was that the Belzer followers had a god to worship, and the Seekers had none. The Belzer religion would encounter the companions, and specifically a young Raceland Majere, who would reveal them for the charlatans that they were, nearly getting himself burned at the stake in the process, opening a vacuum for the Seekers to enter. The people felt duped and accepted the seemingly honest search for gods with the Seeker movement with open arms. From Haven, the Seeker religion spread like wildfire. Gateway and Solace quickly joined the trinity of Seeker towns, and many small hamlets would be led by Seeker clerics. As with any organized religion, the Seekers outgrew their founders and even their followers, becoming an entity unto itself. Like the king priest before them, the fear of losing power led to inquisitions, instilling a culture of spy networks whose sole aim was to control the population. By the time the War of the Lance came around, many Seeker theocrats like Hederic and council members like Lokar were revealed to be nothing more than unscrupulous traitors to the populace who held them in high regard. They made deals with dragon high lords, who only enslaved the population when it was convenient. The main arm of the Seekers was the clerical branch, with all initiates eventually becoming known as Seeker priests. There were various ranks within the priesthood, though the Seekers possessed no actual divine power. Their miracles were theatrical performances, sleight of hand and stage magic designed to give desperate people the illusion of divine presence. This suggests that any who claimed prophetic visions during this period and attributed them to divine sources were either deliberate frauds or genuinely deluded individuals, mistaking their own hopes and fears for divine revelation. Those who had possessed true prophetic sight before the cataclysm, if any survived into the age of despair, would have recognized these deceptions clearly. They would have understood the difference between genuine divine vision and manufactured spectacle. But their warnings would have carried no more weight than anyone else's claims. Without the ability to demonstrate prophetic sight through accurate prediction of specific future events, without divine miracles to validate their authority, they were just voices among thousands, all claiming truth, none able to prove it. Yet beneath this surface chaos of false prophecy and religious fraud, genuine knowledge was being preserved through methods that did not require active divine intervention. The elven nations, particularly Sylvanstee, maintained archives that contained prophecies recorded during earlier ages. These ancient verses and visions, created by seers who had glimpsed futures extending centuries or millennia beyond their own time, would have included descriptions of the age of despair and guidance for surviving it. Elven scholars, with their long lifespans and cultural emphasis on preserving knowledge, would have worked to decode and interpret these fragmentary prophecies. The Knights of Solamnia, despite being persecuted during the Shadow Years, maintained their ancient measure, their comprehensive code of conduct and historical record. The measure would have contained wisdom from earlier ages, including prophecies that had been incorporated into Solamnic tradition. Throughout the Age of Despair, even as Solamnic power and influence declined dramatically, the knights who remained true to the measure would have studied these texts, finding in them strength to endure. The wizard orders, serving the three gods of magic, who alone among the deities had maintained some form of presence through the moons, possessed unique status during this age. Solinari, Lunitari, and Nuitari never withdrew completely from Krynn. Wizards could still draw power from these moons, still cast spells, still access magic when clerics could not. This created a situation where arcane knowledge became the only reliable form of supernatural power available to mortals. Some wizards attempted to develop magical methods of divination that could substitute for prophetic sight. Spells that would reveal the future through arcane means rather than divine channels. These efforts would have met with limited success. Divination magic could provide glimpses of immediate futures, warnings about dangers approaching within hours or days. But the grand scope of true prophetic vision, the ability to see events decades or centuries ahead with perfect clarity, this remained beyond the reach of arcane methods. In the Fifth Age, after the gods departed once more during the Chaos War, a form of spiritual power emerged that operated outside traditional divine frameworks. Goldmoon, who had been the first true cleric of Mayshakal during the War of the Lance, discovered mysticism with the aid of the sage. Magic she referred to as healing of the heart. This would change the trajectory of her life in an echo of her past. Goldmoon traveled to the Isle of Shalsi and built the Citadel of Light near the Silver Stair, a location where anyone could learn the art of mysticism. While this development occurred after the Age of Despair, it demonstrates an important principle that may have had earlier precedents. Spiritual power and connection to higher truths might exist independent of the specific gods who had abandoned Krynn during the Age of Despair. Whether similar practices emerged during that earlier period of divine absence, we cannot know with certainty from the historical record. But the fact that mysticism could develop during the Fifth Age suggests the possibility that some individuals during the Age of Despair found ways to access spiritual awareness outside traditional clerical channels. Throughout these 3 centuries, the memory of true prophecy faded gradually from living experience into legend. Children born in the age of despair grew to adulthood without ever witnessing genuine divine power. Raised on stories about oracles and clerics that seemed as fantastical as tales of dragons and magic swords. By the time generations had passed, and those who remembered the world before the cataclysm had died, many people doubted whether true prophecy had ever existed. Perhaps the old stories were exaggerations. Perhaps what earlier ages had called divine sight was merely skilled observation and fortunate guessing. The question of why the gods withdrew and how long they would remain absent haunted theological scholars throughout the age of despair. The surviving prophecies from before the cataclysm that addressed this topic would have been frustratingly vague, lacking specific durations or conditions for divine return. Some scholars argued the gods would return when mortals had suffered enough to appreciate divine mercy. Others believed the absence was permanent. A few optimists suggested the gods were waiting for mortals to demonstrate they could maintain faith without constant divine reinforcement. During the time of dragons, beginning in 337 Dale Reckoning, Takasis nominates 5 dragon high lords who would become the leaders of the 5 armies of the dragon armies. Ariakas was chosen as the leader of the high lords. The dragon armies claimed sanction and the region of Estwalda. By 348 in spring, the dragon armies poured eastward upon Krynn, and Nordmar, Ballifer, and Goodland were overrun with little resistance. The War of the Lance had begun. It was during this war that Goldmoon, a Queshu chieftain's daughter, discovered the blue crystal staff and the discs of Meshachkul, ancient artifacts hidden before the cataclysm and preserved through the age of despair. These artifacts contained not merely proof of the true God's existence, but also teachings of Paladine and the promise of divine return. Goldmoon became the first true cleric of the New Age, channeling healing power that demonstrated beyond doubt that divine connection had been restored. The discovery of the discs marked the beginning of rediscovery of ancient prophetic wisdom. These artifacts, hidden by those who had foreseen both the cataclysm and the eventual restoration, proved that the ancient oracles had truly seen across centuries, that their visions had been accurate even when describing events that would unfold only after 300 years of divine absence. This validation of ancient prophecy would inspire the archaeological and scholarly efforts that would follow in subsequent years. The age of despair, for all its suffering and silence, became a crucible that tested whether faith could endure without divine presence to sustain it. The false prophets who rose in the vacuum were eventually exposed as frauds when divine power truly returned, and the contrast became undeniable. And the ancient visions, preserved through centuries of darkness by faithful archivists and storytellers, proved accurate when the conditions they described finally manifested, and the gods returned to a world that had learned, perhaps, something about the difference between genuine faith and prideful certainty. Section 5: Awakening and Rediscovery. The War of the Lance shattered the silence that had gripped Krynn for 3 centuries. And with the return of the gods came the return of genuine divine power. But you must understand that this restoration was not a simple resumption of what had existed before. The world had been transformed by the Age of Despair, and the religious traditions that emerged in its aftermath carried the scars and lessons of those silent centuries. Those who received divine gifts in this new age found themselves examining the wisdom of their predecessors, seeking to understand how prophecy had functioned in earlier eras, and why warnings had gone unheeded when they were most needed. The discovery of the discs of Meshachkal marked the beginning of this restoration. These ancient artifacts, hidden before the Cataclysm and preserved through the Age of Despair, contained proof of the true God's existence and teachings meant to guide the faithful. Goldmoon, a Queshu chieftain's daughter, found the blue crystal staff and became the first true cleric of the New Age, channeling healing power that demonstrated beyond doubt that divine connection had been restored. Takassis had actually been the first to violate the divine retreat, and evil clerics among the dragon armies had been openly casting spells during their new empire's founding. It was not until after Goldmoon's discovery that clerics of good and neutral deities would start appearing in Krynn once again. This staggered return, with the Queen of Darkness breaking the divine compact before the other gods chose to return, shaped the early years of the war and demonstrated that even among the gods, the lessons of the Cataclysm had not been equally absorbed. The War of the Lance itself, beginning in 348 Dale Reckoning, tested whether mortals had learned anything from 3 centuries of divine absence. The conflict eventually ended in victory against the dragon armies, though at tremendous cost. The aftermath saw significant social and political restructuring. The Age of Despair had sparked significant unrest, with many from lower classes rising against nobles and knights who had pledged to safeguard them. The War of the Lance helped restore some order, as the knighthood played a vital role in overcoming the dragon armies. But the world that emerged was fundamentally different from what had existed before the Cataclysm. As divine power flowed back into Krynn, individuals across the continent began experiencing prophetic visions without warning or preparation. These spontaneous seers based on what we understand about how prophecy functioned in earlier ages, would have faced significant challenges. Without the training systems and supporting structures that had existed before the cataclysm, without the accumulated knowledge of how to safely channel divine sight, many would have struggled with visions they did not understand and could not control. The holy orders of the stars were gradually reestablished, though in forms modified by the lessons of the Age of Despair and the memory of what the king priest's corruption had wrought. The new clerical hierarchies, understanding viscerally the danger of certainty, unchecked by humility, would have built different structures than those that had failed so catastrophically in Istar's final years. The balance between the gods of good, neutrality, and evil, which Beldenaz had violated with his persecution of neutral deities, would need to be consciously maintained to prevent similar corruption. The blood sea of Istar formed when the burning mountains struck, and the holy city was dragged beneath the waves, became a site of both remembrance and ongoing mystery. The region continued to be marked by the cataclysm's effects. The maelstrom, a permanent storm feature, forced continuous rain clouds eastward. The waters themselves carried the weight of catastrophe, and sailors treated them with appropriate caution. Beneath those waves lay the ruins of Istar itself, including structures of profound historical and religious significance. The Tower of the Blood Sea, originally known as the Bloody-Fingered Hand, had been the second highest structure in Istar at 500 feet tall. This flawless white crystal tower would catch the sunlight and split it into sparkling rainbows. Before the cataclysm, after the lost battles when the conclave of wizards destroyed the towers of Losarkham and Daltigoth, the Tower of Istar was rededicated and used as a repository of sacred artifacts confiscated from heretical religions. They were all stored in the Hall of Sacrilege, called the Solio Febales. As corruption set in during Istar's final years, the evil artifacts were joined by neutral and good artifacts. When the cataclysm struck, it was believed that all of the ancient and sacred magic and knowledge was lost forever. But it was not. The Tower of the Blood Sea survived beneath the waves, its delicate crystalline walls still standing, the light that penetrated the ocean giving it an ethereal quality. What knowledge might be preserved within that drowned structure? What prophecies might be recorded in texts that water could not destroy? These questions would intrigue scholars and adventurers in the years following the War of the Lance. The Elven nations, which had maintained the most complete archives throughout the Age of Despair, became centers of historical scholarship in the New Age. The libraries of Sylvansti contained verses and visions recorded across millennia, prophecies that had survived the cataclysm because they had been preserved in locations far from the epicenter of destruction. Scholars studying these texts would have worked to compare ancient predictions with the events that had unfolded, seeking to understand which prophecies had proven accurate and what that accuracy revealed about the nature of divine sight. The Kender, whose cultural practices had preserved knowledge through the age of despair, in ways more organized societies could not replicate, possessed stories and prophecies they had heard from oracles before the cataclysm. While Kender were unreliable about many things, their memories for stories were remarkable, and they could recite verses they had heard decades earlier with impressive fidelity. Elder Kender, who had lived before the cataclysm, would have carried in their memories the last echoes of prophecies spoken by seers who died in that catastrophe. The Knights of Salamnia, rebuilding their order after the devastation of the war and the centuries of persecution that preceded it, returned to their ancient measure with new appreciation for its wisdom. The measure contained not merely codes of conduct, but accumulated knowledge from earlier ages, principles that had guided knights through previous crises. Studying these texts with fresh eyes after 3 centuries of divine absence would have revealed layers of meaning that earlier generations might have taken for granted. The wizard orders, whose gods of magic had never fully withdrawn during the Age of Despair, possessed their own archives related specifically to arcane power and its role in Krynn's history. The mages who had maintained the towers of high sorcery, particularly the mobile tower of Wereth, which had survived both the cataclysm and the subsequent attacks by Asterian forces, had preserved knowledge that clerical orders had lost. This created interesting dynamics in the post-war period, as arcane and divine practitioners worked to understand how their different forms of power related to each other and to the broader patterns of Krynn's destiny. Yet even as these recovery efforts proceeded, new challenges approached. The age that followed the War of the Lance would not be one of stable restoration. The Chaos War, erupting decades later, would once again threaten everything mortals had rebuilt. And following that conflict, the gods would depart again, this time not in judgment, but in sacrifice, removing themselves from Krynn to save it from chaos. This would usher in the 5th Age, the Age of Mortals, when Krynn would be forced to function without divine presence once more. During this 5th Age, which began at the end of the Chaos War and lasted just shy of 40 years, significant events would reshape the world. It saw the actual absence of the gods as they worked to save the planet of Krynn from chaos. It witnessed the arrival of the dragon overlords and the terraforming of the land, in some cases entirely decimating populations. And it saw the emergence of mysticism, a form of spiritual power that operated outside traditional divine frameworks. Goldmoon, who had been the first true cleric of Meshachel during the War of the Lance, discovered mysticism with the aid of the sage. Magic she referred to as healing of the heart. This would change the trajectory of her life in an echo of her past. Goldmoon traveled to the Isle of Shalsey and built the Citadel of Light near the Silver Stair, a location where anyone could learn the art of mysticism. This development demonstrated that spiritual power and connection to higher truths could exist independent of the specific gods, a revelation that challenged traditional theological understanding, but also provided hope during another period of divine absence. The pattern that emerged across these ages, from the age of dreams through the age of despair, and into the Fifth Age and beyond, revealed fundamental truths about prophecy and its role in Krynn's history. Prophetic visions, when they came from genuine divine sources, were accurate and specific. The oracles who had foreseen the cataclysm had truly perceived what would occur. The seers who glimpsed the age of despair had accurately understood its duration and character. And those who saw beyond even those events had perceived real futures, not merely possibilities. But accuracy did not guarantee that warnings would be heeded. The greatest catastrophes in Krynn's history had been foreseen and warned against by prophets whose voices were systematically silenced or ignored. The fall of the ogre empires, the corruption of Istar, the cataclysm itself, all could have been mitigated, if not entirely prevented, had the warnings been taken seriously by those in power. This pattern suggested that the true purpose of prophecy was not to prevent disaster, but to test whether mortals possessed the wisdom and humility to recognize truth, even when that truth contradicted their own certainty. The scholars and clerics studying this history, in the wake of the War of the Lance, extracted lessons that would shape religious practice in subsequent years. Prophecy was given for guidance and correction, not for validation or comfort. Seers who spoke truths that leaders wanted to hear were less valuable than those who warned against paths that seemed righteous but led to ruin. The suppression of uncomfortable prophecy was not merely foolish, but spiritually dangerous. A rejection of divine wisdom in favor of mortal pride. These principles, hard-won through centuries of catastrophe and silence, became foundations for how the restored clerical orders approached their relationship with prophetic truth. Yet even as these lessons were being learned, the cycles continued. The gods departed again after the Chaos War. They returned in the Age of Mortals. The balance between divine presence and mortal agency, between prophetic certainty and free will, between the wisdom to see clearly and the courage to act on what was seen. These tensions remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Krynn's history suggested they were meant to remain in tension, that the struggle itself was essential to the world's nature. The forgotten oracles of earlier ages those whose names had been erased and whose warnings had been suppressed, achieved a form of vindication through this historical understanding. They had seen clearly when clarity was dangerous. They had spoken truth when truth was forbidden. They had preserved knowledge through methods designed to survive the very catastrophes they foresaw. And their echoes, recovered from ruins and archives, from oral traditions and encoded texts, from structures that survived beneath the waves and verses preserved in elven memory, continued to speak to those patient enough to listen. You have walked now through the silent ages, descended into the archaeology of forgotten wisdom, excavated voices that were buried under centuries of deliberate erasure and accidental loss. The legacy of these prophets endures in every warning spoken and heeded, in every uncomfortable truth that finds audience rather than suppression, in every society that chooses wisdom over certainty and humility over pride. The story of Krynn's oracles continues beyond the ages we have explored tonight, extending into times still unfolding. The patterns remain relevant because the fundamental tensions remain unresolved. Divine sight grants knowledge, but not necessarily power to act on that knowledge. Prophecy reveals truth, but cannot force acceptance of that truth. The future can be seen, but whether it can be changed remains the eternal question that each generation must answer for itself. If you found value in this journey through Krynn's silent ages, if these recovered prophecies and forgotten voices resonated with your own search for deeper understanding, I invite you to like this exploration and subscribe to the channel. There are more stories waiting to be told, more layers of lore to excavate, more echoes to recover from the foundations of worlds, both familiar and strange. Until next time, may your own sight be clear, your voice be strong, and your courage be sufficient to speak truth even when truth is dangerous.